We're going to be talking a little bit, just briefly, for about half an hour or so, about what is the Vedic way of knowing God. And of course, I wrote this book about precisely the subject, the Vedic way of knowing God. And before I talk about precisely what is the Vedic way of knowing God, I want to talk about how this book came about, because it's a somewhat interesting story. When I was an undergraduate student at Loyola University in Chicago, I was a philosophy and theology major. And that was one of the most interesting, thrilling, really, times of my life, because I had the opportunity to study both philosophy, but also primarily Christian theology, actually, Judeo-Christian theology, with some of the greatest minds in both of those fields. One of my professors, for example, was Father Leo Sweeney, who was a Jesuit priest, but also, and I'm not sure if he's still even alive, but when he was alive, when I was studying with him, he was considered the primary scholar of Thomas Aquinas in the Western world. His teacher was Etienne Gilson, who, when he was alive, was the greatest also authority on Thomas Aquinas. So again, I had the opportunity to study with some truly wonderful individuals. One of these individuals was a professor whose name was Tracy Pinchman, and a very interesting lady. She was a young lady at the time. They had just hired her in the theology department as the person to teach all the rest of the stuff. You know, the theology department, of course, focused on Christianity. It was a Catholic university, Loyola University, a Jesuit university, and they hired her to do the rest of the stuff, meaning Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc. She herself was Jewish, but her specialty was Hinduism. And just truly a wonderful individual. Today, she's a famous professor. She's written many, many books. But back then, again, she was just hired as a professor. And of course, she and I got along very, very well. We had many, many philosophical talks about Hinduism. And it was in a discussion that I had with her, actually, approximately 1994, that we discussed what I should focus on my dissertation, which was interesting since I was still undergrad, but she knew I wanted to go on and get my PhD. And she suggested something interesting, and that is that since I was personally interested in and personally steeped in and following the tradition of what is called Vaishnavism, or theism within the Hindu tradition, that I should focus specifically on that. So she's the first person who put this kind of germ of an idea in my mind. And in the book, I acknowledge her for having done that. Later on in graduate school, as I thought about the topic a little bit deeper, I realized what I needed to write about specifically for my dissertation. And it was this. At that point, having studied a great deal of philosophy, both Eastern and Western, but especially focusing on Sanatana Dharma, one vacuum that I had seen was precisely this. When it comes to the discussion of what is the nature of God, of course, everyone has an opinion. All the world religions are based on such opinions. You know, the Muslims will say one thing, the Christians will say another thing. Then, of course, you have the Catholics who will say something different from the Protestants, who will say something different from the Mormons, and on and on. And then you can go on with all the various religions, all the various philosophies. They all have their own proposition about what is the nature of the divine, what is the nature of God. And while all of these opinions are interesting, one thing that I realized is that, unfortunately, especially when it came to the dharmic conception of the divine, the Vedic conception of the divine. What is an even more fundamental question than what is God is this: how can we even claim to know something about God? You know, again, everyone is claiming that they know something about God. You know, the evangelical Christian, well, this is what God is, this person, this is what God is. But this is the fundamental question, really. How do you know? How can you even make the claim? In other words, as I was saying previously, this is the real question. How is it even possible for the finite to know the infinite? Because again, when we hear this term, we see the inherent contradiction that lies within. If we are finite beings, and let's not fool ourselves, we are indeed finite beings. How do we know we're finite beings? Because we are not omniscient, at least at present. We don't have all the knowledge of the world. We know that we're limited. We know that we're mortal. We know that we're an illusion, and I can go on and on and on. We are beings who in Sanskrit are considered anu, finite. There's an actual word for what the Atman is, anu. It means infinitesimal, it means finite. This being the case, how is it that we can grasp the nature of that which is infinite, or God? Let's go. Again, spoken of in these terms, it is logically an impossibility. So then, having accepted this cognitively, where does this leave us? Where does it leave us? As beings who can never know the divine? Of course not. Of course not. Because it is our very raison d'etre. It is our very nature to know the divine. This is why we exist. This is what gives us our being, is to know the divine. Backing up a little bit, of course it is our very nature to know, in general, again, as I was saying earlier. As Atman, as these eternal sparks, units of consciousness that are eternal, that are full of bliss, that are full of wisdom, that are indeed perfect in their very essence. One of the hallmarks of what it means to be a conscious living being, in other words, to have consciousness, is to want to know, to want to experience. We know this, we discussed this when we talked about the Yoga Sutras. Patanjali calls the Atman, the soul, drashtar, meaning the experiencer. Well, what does this mean? It means that we are meant to know. We're constantly searching, and ultimately we're searching for the divine. Now, all this having been said, I realized when I was in graduate school that this is the topic that I needed to write about as my dissertation. And this is precisely what I did. I originally wrote this as my dissertation topic. Really, I began writing it in 1998, but it came to fruition around the year 2000-2001, which is when I finished it as my dissertation. It passed as a dissertation with quite a bit of controversy because I wanted to discuss Vedic philosophy on the terms of Vedic philosophy. And that's something you don't do in graduate school. You need to have a prism that is quote-unquote scientific, quote-unquote Western, quote-unquote materialist oriented. I refuse to do that. I refuse to take a neo-Marxist Freudian perspective on, on the Vedic literatures. And instead, what I needed to do ultimately was quite literally create my own methodologies for studying the Vedic scriptures, which caused a lot of debate when I finally had to defend my dissertation, but ultimately it was accepted because it could not be refuted. And I had 5 professors debate me at once and try to refute my methodology, and they couldn't. Why am I bringing this up? Because that little story in and of itself kind of shows one of the primary problems that we living in the Western world have in understanding the Vedic worldview. And that is that if we are indeed to understand the Vedic worldview, we have to understand it on its own terms. But then, by extension, for those of us who claim that we want to know truth, and this is where it gets personal and interesting, for those of us who claim that we want to know truth, in other words, God, who is synonymous with truth. We also need to understand truth and God on its own terms. And this is the difficulty that so many people who are on the religious path end up encountering. I claim I want to know truth, but do I really want to have my own self-justified version of truth and then project that onto God, or do I want to know truth as it truly is, as it is, without change? For those individuals who want the latter, what we will find is that truth is indeed something that's knowable. Again, the finite can know the infinite. The finite can know the infinite. But how is that truth knowable? By understanding that the way that the finite can know the infinite is by the grace of the infinite. See, grace trumps logic. Grace trumps logic. So even though really logically it's not possible for the finite to know the infinite, if the infinite is indeed the infinite, then the infinite in itself has the ability to make itself known. Otherwise the infinite is not the infinite. This is what omnipotence means. Thus it is by the grace of the divine that we know the divine, even though by all intents and purposes, logically, we shouldn't be able to. This is the mystery. This is the nature of the divine. Now, let me talk a little bit about precisely what is the science of knowing according to the Vedic worldview. And this is a fascinating topic. This is the gist of what the book is about, the Vedic way of knowing God. And let's begin with this. Again, as living beings, we are all meant to know. But how is it that we know anything that exists around us? First of all, there are three conditions that are necessary. Okay? To know anything, literally anything that you can think of. To know anything, there are three conditions that must be there. First, of course, there is the knower. There is the person who wishes to know something. Okay? The second thing that is there is the object of knowledge, that thing which you wish to know. Okay? It's pretty logical so far. The third element that also is important is that there must be the medium, that through which the knower knows the object of knowledge. Okay? So this is important. You have to keep this in mind as we go on with this talk. So there is the experiencer, there is the person who wishes to know, there is the object of knowledge, there is that through which we know. All right? So, to give an example, I am the person who wishes to have knowledge. I am the knower. All right? What do I want to know? What is that object of knowledge? I want to know, is there a glass of water somewhere within my vicinity? All right? Well, do I have to use a medium to know that? Yes. I use my eyes. You see? And that way I know. All right, now keep these three things in mind as we now go on. Having said that, generally speaking, in the Vedic worldview, there are three different and distinct ways of knowing. And these are all very interesting. The first of these is pratyaksha, what is called pratyaksha. Pratyaksha is a bringing together of really two Sanskrit terms. Prati means to or toward, aksha means the eye. So to or toward the eye. Okay, this is what's called empiricism. In other words, the way that we know anything that is material is through the senses. So when we use this term pratyaksha, we're talking about sensory knowledge. All right? Very important. So anything that is comprised of matter, if I wish to know it, we must know it through the senses. Okay? Now let me stop there for 1 second. One thing that you are going to see with these three primary ways of knowing is that the means of knowing, the medium through which we know, has to be the same as the object of knowledge. Okay? Do you understand that statement? Very important. So in other words, okay, if I wish to know matter, the medium has to be material. Okay? Exactly, exactly. The senses are material. If I wish to know something material, I have to use something material. Okay? Let me just first mention the second way of knowing, but then come back to what we're just talking about now. The second way of knowing is anumana, or inference, logic, reasoning, etc. Can I use reasoning to know if there is a glass of water here? I can't, because it is not illogical for there to not be a glass of water here. You see? So I cannot use reasoning. I have to use material senses to grasp something material. All right? Okay. Now, let's deal with this second way of knowing, what is called anumana. Anumana means inference, logic, reasoning. Okay? It is through this way of knowing that we can know correspondingly objects that are intellectual in nature. Okay? So, the two primary categories of this would be mathematics and logic. Okay? 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 1 does not equal 75. How do I know this? Do I have to see something to know this? Do I have to hear something to know this? We don't use the senses, but yet we know that's true, correct? If I were to ask anyone here to stake your life, will you stake your life that 1 plus 1 does not equal 75? No one will stake their life. No, we know. We don't have to see anything. We don't have to experience anything. How do we know? By using anumana. Okay, by using reasoning. So there are certain laws of reasoning, of logic, of cognitive grasping that exist such that we can only know them through anumana, through inference. Okay. Another example that's given, and this is a very famous example that's given in Vedic logic. If you are observing a mountain and you see tremendous plumes of smoke coming from the mountain, but all you see is the smoke, you can infer that there is a fire. Now, you're not seeing the fire. You are not visually, sensorially, empirically seeing the fire, but you know there's a fire. Again, you could practically bet your life that there is a fire on that mountain. Why? Because you're making a logical inference, because where there is fire, there is smoke. There's this causality that's there. So again, we're using the principles of reasoning in order to understand things that are beyond the senses. Okay? Now, having said this, having talked about these two ways of knowing, I'll go to the third in a minute, but first we have to deal with these two. There is a problem with these two ways of knowing. First, again, empiricism or pratyaksha deals only with that which is sensory, that which is material. Anumana or inference, logic, reasoning, deals only with those categories of being that are intellectual in nature. Okay? Now, this is the difficulty. Both of these are faulty. Both of these are limited in many ways. They are limited in and of themselves, even when it comes to the proper object of their knowledge. But then what to speak of knowing God? So let's deal with the first one, pratyaksha, empiricism. It is impossible to know God through the senses. Why? Because, of course, God is not physical. God is not material. Therefore, God is a being that does not correspond epistemologically with that way of knowing. More, the senses are faulty. The senses are faulty. Our senses are not perfect. But we'll deal a little bit deeper with that in a minute. Let's go to anumana. Let's go to reasoning. Is it possible to know the divine through reasoning and through reasoning alone? It's not. Reasoning is powerful. It's more subtle than empiricism. However, it also is limited. We have computers now that can calculate faster than the human mind. You see, so we know the human mind is limited in how much mathematical equations it can do, and in how logical it can be. Okay. Plus, again, the object of knowledge that we're seeking to know, namely the divine, is trans-empirical, but also trans-intellectual. In other words, transcending logic, transcending the intellect. Therefore, again, the object that we wish to know, the divine, does not have a direct correspondence to that means of knowing, logic. Thus, we cannot simply use logic to know the divine. All right? Now, a little bit deeper, I want to refer very specifically to the book. There are 4 specific human defects that are understood to exist in every human being. And let me just quickly go through these. The first one is Brahma, which is the tendency to fall victim to illusion. In other words, we have the ability to make mistakes, to be in illusion. The famous example that's given again and again in Vedanta is that you're walking down the street and you see a snake in the road before you and you jump back in fright only to realize, oh, it wasn't a snake, it was a rope. See, we can fall under illusion. All right. Second, pramada, error caused by inattentiveness. Inattentiveness. Who here has ever been a student and the professor is lecturing, but our mind is somewhere else? Is there anyone here for who that hasn't happened? So we have the ability to be inattentive. Okay? Vipralasa, the desire to cheat, the desire to lie not only to others, but to ourselves. You know, how many people have we engaged in debate with? I know I have thousands of times. And as we're debating with the person, we know we're making a logical point that cannot be refuted, but the person refuses to accept it simply on emotional grounds, or because they have their pet theory and they simply, again, refuse to accept that which is logical. They're cheating both when it comes to trying to attain the truth, but they're also cheating themselves. Okay? Karanapatava. Error arising from inherent insufficiency of the sense organs. Again, very simply, our senses are limited. You know, our senses are limited. When we look up in the sky, let's say at night, and we see something about the size of a quarter that looks flat, that's floating there in space, is it the size of a quarter? And is it flat? No, it's the moon. It's the moon. It's massive. But again, our senses are insufficient. Our senses will lie to us. So, these are 4 human defects that every human being has. As a result of which, pratyaksha and anumana, these 2 ways of knowing, are then negated. They're negated. So it is not possible to know the divine through these 2 ways of knowing. Now, how is it possible to know the divine? It is possible through this third means, this third, what is called epistemic mechanism. And that is what's called shabda. Shabda. Now, before I explicate that word, let me go a little bit deeper into, first, what is the meaning of this? Again, keep in mind that when we want to know an object, the medium through which we know that object has to correspond with that object. Okay? That's something that's very important. However, interestingly, and this is where it gets very interesting, when it comes to Shabda, we have the ability to know the nature of God, however, without a medium. Without a medium. So this contradicts everything that I just said, doesn't it? It doesn't. Because where now is that correspondence between the individual who wishes to know and that object, which now is God? That correspondence lies within the realm of consciousness itself. And this is why a medium is not necessary when knowing the divine. So in other words, when we know the divine, again, there is a correspondence that is there. It is consciousness understanding consciousness, grasping consciousness. This is how ultimately we can know God. And interestingly, without a medium, without anything in between us and the divine. In this way, Shabda is radically different from the other 2 ways of knowing. First, because there is no medium. Second, because we are now dealing not with the physical, not with the intellectual, but with the highest thing of all, which is consciousness itself. Okay? And in this way, when we come to understand the relationship of consciousness to consciousness, and specifically of finite consciousness to infinite consciousness, in other words, us with God, when we understand this relationship, we understand that there is no separation between us. This is why in every mystical tradition, and not just among the rishis, but every mystical tradition, the mystics talk about this experience of oneness between themselves and the divine. We hear this again and again. You know, we hear this again and again. So many mystics, St. Francis of Assisi, Hildegard von Bingen in the Christian tradition, certainly the rishis, but so many people in so many different traditions all talk about this, what is called unitive experience between themselves and the divine. Unio mystica, it's called in Latin, where they feel as if they and the divine are one. Now we can begin to understand what's meant by this statement. However, of course, as I always have to point out, we need to understand in what sense there is that oneness. Does it mean that the mystic quite literally becomes God? There is no becoming God. You see, if you even listen to the words, you can see the inherent contradiction in such a statement. There is no becoming God. If you need to become God, you were not God to begin with, because God always is God. So the mystic does not become God. Rather, what is experienced by the mystic is, again, this lack of boundary between our consciousness and the divine consciousness. That there is no medium in between. There is no fence. There is no fence. We experience this actually even in our everyday life. If you've ever been in love with someone, do you not sometimes feel as if you and the other person are one? Well, imagine this, but to an infinite degree and to an eternal degree. This is what we experience with the divine. This sort of oneness, where you don't literally lose yourself in the divine. You are still you. See, without you being an experiencer, there's no meaning to the experience. This is why Buddhism falls apart. That's why Buddhism doesn't work. There has to be an experiencer. There has to be an eternal self to experience. Otherwise, the experience ceases to exist. It has no meaning. So, with ourselves as this experiencer, as Atman, we understand this infinite closeness, and we experience this infinite closeness with the divine to such an extent that there is no boundary anymore. Now, what does this mean practically as far as knowledge? Because that's what we're talking about, ultimately. Knowledge, knowing the divine. Well, if we and the divine are one, again, in this sense of there not being boundary between us, then is it not the case that we then, of course, know what the divine knows? This is how truth is revealed according to the Vedic way. When we come to the point as spiritual practitioners where we have achieved this union with the divine, where we have achieved liberation, where we have achieved enlightenment, where this separation, this artificial separation between ourselves and God is now gone, what then happens is we become what is called a rishi. Rishi. A rishi is a being who has this experience and then has the ability, because their ego is gone, because these 4 defects that we spoke about are now gone, because they have transcended bodily and intellectual concern and are existing on a plane of pure consciousness, where you see insufficiency of the senses doesn't matter anymore, where cheating, the propensity to want to cheat and to want to win, is not there anymore, where again all 4 of these defects are transcended by the individual. Now the individual has the ability to themselves subjectively experience and grasp and understand pure truth, but more, they also have the ability to reveal that truth to others. So this sounds like a very high state, doesn't it? It's almost inconceivable to us. This seems like such a high state. And yet, this is what's amazing. For ourselves, as who we truly are, as Atman, that's just normal. That's just normal. That's just our normal state of being. Is to be able to so grasp truth and so perfectly. That's just our normal state of being. The fact that we are not grasping the truth in such a way right now is abnormal. This is what sometimes we forget. You know, we tend to think of things from illusion on up instead of from liberation on down. You know, our perspective has to change. So that when we hear about such exalted states of liberation. And when we think to themselves, oh my Lord, oh that's something that's way out there and hopefully someday I'll be able to achieve that. No, the question is, well, why aren't we experiencing that now? That's our normal state. And it's a shame that we're not. So again, when we speak about the state of perfect union and knowledge, communion, yoga, union with the Absolute, we're talking about something that is natural and inherent to our very being. But of course, this being the material cosmos, it is the minority of individuals who have the ability to actually experience such a state at any one given time. Such individuals are called rishis, seers, seer sages. These are the people who reveal our scriptures. These are the people who reveal the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads, etc. But more, and this is the important point, how do we know God? We know God by becoming such a being. We know God by becoming such a being. The title of the talk today is The Vedic Way of Knowing God, and then the Epistemology of Consciousness. This is the epistemology of consciousness. The word epistemology very simply means the science of knowing. The science of knowing, the way of knowing. How is it that we know? And this is indeed how we know the divine in the Vedic way, an epistemology of consciousness. Through our consciousness, we know the Supreme Consciousness. And then have the ability to ourselves know the truth, but then help others know the truth, reveal that truth to others. So, this is the Vedic way of knowing God in the smallest of nutshells.